Our guest today is the former CFO and co-president at WWE. His brand new book, Sometimes Wrong But Never in Doubt, How a Cuban Kid from Queens Transformed WWE, is out now, and it's a pleasure to be joined to Post Wrestling by George Barrios. George, thank you very much for the time today.
Thanks for having me, John. Happy to be here.
What is it like hitting the media circuit here? This is obviously, you were somebody that was kind of at the forefront of doing a lot of pretty much every conference, every hearing you were at the forefront of at WWE, but now it's a bit of a different set of circumstances where you are the subject and talking about the book.
It's been a lot of fun. Enjoy, getting a chance to talk to people like you who are knowledgeable either about WWE. The book is a bit about leadership, a bit about the business of sports, obviously a lot about wrestling and WWE. So whichever kind of, prism it is, it's fun to talk about smart people, good questions. And, there's nothing more. I enjoy it quite a bit. So it's been a lot of fun.
Well, I want to take you back to a press release that was issued in March of 2008, announcing that effective March 24th, that George Barrios has been named the WWE's new chief financial officer, then CEO, Linda McMahon stating, quote, "At a time when we are focused on growth initiatives around the world, we are confident that George's experience will be a tremendous asset for WWE's future." So take our listeners back to March of 2008 and where the company stands. This is several months before the move to the PG format. And what are some of the top priorities that you're hitting the ground attacking?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to go back about 3 or 4 months before that, which would have been at the end of 2007 when I first get the call from the guy doing the executive search for the role from Spencer Stewart. And he says, "Hey, I've got this great role. It's right what you're looking for. Public company, 400 million in revenue, so decent size. It's profitable. And by the way, it's a bonus. It's in Stamford. He knows I live in Connecticut. Better commute than New York City." I'm like, "Hey, that sounds pretty good. What is it, Adam?" And he goes, "WWE." And I go, "Well, what's that?" And he goes, "The wrestling." And I go, verbatim, "Are you fucking kidding me? You just call me with that shit?" Because he and I have been working on a bunch of other stuff, that taught him. I'm like, "What? Come on." And he says to me, because he knows me, he goes, "George, you know how you always say that you're not really interested in other people's opinions? You just want to know the data, and then you'll kind of form your opinion." I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, how much data do you know about WWE? What do you know about WWE?" Silence on my end, other than I had watched it as a kid and through college. And he goes, "So why don't you listen to your own advice, learn a little more?" So I do that. And I would be lying if I told you that I had the perspective that got formed over the first 18 months, 24 months about what the opportunity was. But what I did see is, hey, this is good business. It's not whatever thing I had in my head, which is what most people at that point had in their head about WWE, some craziness. Met Vince, the rest of the team, and said, "Yeah, this is something I'm going to do." So now to answer your question, you fast forward. Now, during that 3-month period, I accept the role in January of 2024 because of my current deal with the New York Times, where I was the treasurer. It was going to take me a few months to be able to make the transition. So during that time, I remember calling Vince and I'm like, "Hey, are you okay if I work with, some of the folks there to just get me information over the next 2 to 3 months? Because good question. I want to hit the ground running. I don't want to wait." So I know he was impressed right there. He's like, "Oh," he goes, "I'm getting, your brain without having to pay you." And I'm like, "Yeah." I go, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing for, the Times, because I've got a job there to do it. I want to do it well, but I'll, nighttime, I'll be all WWE. So I actually, day one, had a pretty good idea of the business. However, not about the opportunity. That came 18 months, 2 years later. And then to remind you, I went in saying, "Hey, how are we going to grow this thing?" and thinking about that. But we had to deal with the financial crisis almost immediately. Now, as you know, WWE, not a lot of debt like a lot of other companies that are worried about that. But at that moment in time, nobody knew that this thing wasn't going to ripple throughout the entire economy and just shut everything down, right? I mean, there was a real fear of that. I mean, stock market cut in half. People think COVID was bad. That was way worse. So at that point, really, Vince and I and Michelle, she joined a few months later, we probably spent the rest of 08 and most of 09 kind of battening down the hatches and getting our ideas about kind of what, how do we make sure we can survive however bad this gets. So that was the first 18 months. And we did a good job doing that. But it really was, you went late 09, early 2010 is actually when Michelle and I start going, all right, what's the opportunity? And we, I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but we probably spent 12 months doing a ton of work, looking around the world, really kind of dissecting, which, by the way, nobody had really done anywhere, kind of both the media and entertainment, kind of what was happening. And obviously a lot of change was coming. We knew that, and how we would play in that. And look, and it just unlocked this kind of entire, an entire complete pivot in the company to this, not just event-based business, but a content factory, right? We're not just going to create 300 hours of event content. We're going to create thousands of hours of content around all the IP that we had, multiple platforms, social, digital, direct to consumer. And by the way, our view of the world was, and nobody believed it, this was the great unlock. This thing, the value in the chain is live. It's not sports. Everybody goes to sports. Yes, sports is valuable, but sports is valuable because it's live, multi-generational, global, passionate viewership. Hey, guess what? And I heard this for 3 years. Wrestling's not sports. And I said, I don't give a fuck. It's all those other things. And that's what drives the value. And we ended up being right. Everybody else was wrong, and we ended up being right. So that's a big story. I go into the details in the book. But yeah, to ask your question, day one is, hey, we got to kind of work our way through the next 12 to 18 months. And then the fun began.
You have a lot of interesting observations about Vince McMahon in the book, from sort of his introverted nature that you saw, as well as making the comparison point that here was somebody that, he would make a big signing. And we certainly see examples of this with talent, where he is all enamored on the shiny new toy. And then within several months, it can be a 180. And it was interesting for you to share that this definitely dovetailed over on the executive side as well. So was figuring out Vince McMahon almost part of your initiation process too, of how I'm going to work with this figure and a lot of the eccentricities that he possessed?
Yeah, I would say not figuring it out. I have got a point of view, and it's a lifetime now that I've come to it, is you've got to be the best version of yourself. If you try to tailor yourself to a bunch of different people and what do they want, I think you end up with an anodyne or banal kind of caricature of who you really are. So by that point in my career, I wasn't trying to ingratiate myself with Vince. I think what he liked who I was, right? Mm-hmm. He liked the energy. He liked the passion. He liked the optimism. He loved the fact that I got shit done. If I said I was going to get something done, it got done. It got done well, and it got done fast. So he just ended up liking that. Now, I will say it took a little bit because of the personalities to get there. And this is where people who don't interact with Vince have this vision of the character he plays on Raw or SmackDown. He is larger than life, but he's not, he's a quiet guy. And in fact, probably the most difficult thing for him and I to connect on is I'm not. I tend to be a little louder, very comfortable voicing my opinion. Vince, smarter than me, kind of keeps his opinion to himself until the meeting's over. I kind of learned that from him, and actually, because it's a good trait. But any event, to your point, that's what took a little bit more time. It's less around figuring him out. It's like, how do we figure each other out? And that also probably took a couple of years, right? Those first couple of years while we were getting through prepping ourselves for the worst case on the financial crisis. And then certainly once we started and pivoted and said, hey, I still remember when we were talking about the way we saw the opportunity. And look, he's an optimistic guy. And there's nobody more optimistic about WWE than him. But the stuff we were talking about then, we said, hey, we can double, maybe triple, right, the revenue of this company and 10x the profit and 10x the value. That I think he thought at first, he's like, what, these guys are a little bit crazy. But then I think as he saw then us executing and it happening, more and more trust built, and and that led to him making us the co-leaders of the business for the last half of our tenure.
I think over the period that you come into the company versus when you leave the company, I think one of the largest changes is the fact that this went from a company that, yes, a publicly traded one, but also it was a variable business in the sense that this month's pay-per-view is going to be, it depends if we're up or down this month. We're selling tickets at the live events into more of sort of an insulated business where it's a lot of guaranteed revenue, television rights. You certainly enjoy in that boom. And also comes the deal in Saudi Arabia that you detail. Would you characterize that as maybe the most delicate set of negotiations, the most unique deal that you were involved with? I mean, we don't have to get into all of it, but like you paint this clandestine picture that's right out of like a spy thriller of you being flown over overnight to Saudi Arabia. Tell me a little bit about that deal coming together. And then I do want to ask you a bit about the Crown Jewel event in 2018, which immediately you're facing, a lot of public backlash at the onset of this deal that I would imagine like you're entering into this deal that is a potential hurdle that would be to overcome.
Yeah. And you said a lot there. Before I get to the KSA and Crown Jewel, your point about it, and it's a really insightful point that, this gets into business wonkery, that the revenue went from being primarily transactional to primarily contractual as well as subscription, things that are a lot more stable. So that gives you a lot of benefit. People tend to like that better. People on the outside say, oh, that's a good thing. But
I mean, and huge for like, obviously you can't foresee a worldwide pandemic, but that was
right, exactly. Well, and look, to that point, when I started at WWE, because I looked at other companies, one of the companies I looked at to just see how they worked was Cirque du Soleil. If you looked at them and WWE in 2008, almost exactly the same business model, right? Very much event-based, hardly making any money on the media side. And to your point, COVID hits. I think Cirque went bankrupt within a week. WWE had its best year in terms of profitability during COVID. Why? Because the business model had changed, right? Sure, their events business got hurt, but they were still able to perform well. So that point you made as the lead into the KSA story, incredibly key. And then you touched about the media rights. I mean, we would not have participated in the media rights boom if we would not have implemented the strategy we did. Because remember, when we joined, WWE was losing money basically on the production of Raw and SmackDown. It would then have the pay-per-views and the T-shirts and the toys, great stuff. But ultimately, the most valuable thing we had was that live content. We just didn't know it. So that was pivoting that and bringing the world along with us, which everybody told us, no, you're not. That was the biggest part. But back to the KSA. So yeah, this is now 2018. Business is doing really well, right? We're now kind of, we've hit the stride. We've gotten through the swamp of despair, and we're kind of a rocket ship pointing up. So everybody wants to work with us, right? So there was an outreach. We thought it was interesting. One of the things, and Vince and I would talk about this generally, if you're going to be a global business, you have to get comfortable that not every region of the world is similar to the West, right? You have to get comfortable with that, or not, or decide you're not. Now, I'm not saying that your morals are compromised. I'm not saying that. You shouldn't do that. But the world is different. Different parts of the world are different. They have different values, different mores. And so you have to decide, if I'm going to be a global business, I have to get comfortable, and I'll have a red line on things, but I have to get comfortable. So that was the context. We had already been in the Middle East, and I still remember it was in KSA, but when we first started doing events in the Middle East, and there was, debates about that, right? Obviously, the rights of women were at a different place than they are today there, certainly different than they were in the West. But I still remember, and it gets to the KSA and how we thought about it. I think it was an event in Abu Dhabi, and I remember seeing the video. I wasn't at the event, where women WWE athletes, female athletes, had come on the stage, into the ring, and people, that was a rare thing to see a female athlete, ready to do battle, and the crowd started chanting, "There is hope." Right? There is hope. They saw this and they said, this is something that we aspire to in our culture. And look, that makes you feel good. That's not just about the economics. That's just like, hey, this little thing I'm doing to put smiles on people's faces actually has, there's also what I think is a good thing, for the people there. So in any event, with that as the context of the decision-making, The opportunity in KSA comes to us, right? Because we're now doing so well. Number one sports property in the world on digital, including YouTube. And at that point in time, KSA was the number one consumer of YouTube per capita in the world. That's where they got their content. That's what built the opportunity there. The fact that our strategy. And as we're talking about doing this deal, Khashoggi is killed. And so that now creates this different context. And internally, it becomes a difficult decision. I remember Vince, looking, Michelle and I, it was late one night, looking us in the eye and saying, this is the most difficult decision I've ever met. I feel like I'm, like we could be, betting the company. Now, Michelle and I agreed that it was a tough decision given the circumstances. We didn't feel like he did around that. Part of it is, it was literally in the fog of war, probably a bad analogy, in that things were coming out. Nobody knew what had happened, really. The media was writing what the media is writing, but I have a very strong perspective. If you look at what the media wrote a year ago, most of it seems to be wrong. So the media in the hot take moment, it's hard to tell what's going on. So it was a long discussion, and it was to your point about the flight over. We were now in the last throes of getting this done, and we either had to say we're going to get it done or not. And the folks that we were dealing with saying, well, they I guess could sense the cold feet and said, well, we need to get this done now. And so we looked at each other and said, all right, well, who's going? And Vince kind of looked away. Michelle wasn't too keen at that point in time, so I said, no, I'll go. So we had an earnings call the next day. So this is midnight. We got an earnings call the next day at 11. Usually we're preparing for that, not having this conversation, but that's what we did. Got the earnings call, and yeah, to your point, I got on a G6, I think it was, after the earnings call and flew to Riyadh, and that even the negotiation there in Riyadh had its own kind of theatrical elements. But it was one of the most interesting times in my career. Certainly the most interesting negotiation I had done up to that point.
And on that particular earnings call, Vince McMahon does give a statement, and he mentions like the decision for context, Jamal Khashoggi, he is murdered October 2nd. This event is November 2nd. We're talking a month apart. And he states that at the end, like the decision here, full year 2018 guidance is predicated on the staging of the Riyadh event as scheduled. And my question to you is, sometimes it's a philosophical one, that in your position, is there an incentivization to place your morals into these decisions versus looking at the fact, listen, this is an extremely lucrative contract for us. And this was also a case where like the stock took a big hit. This was like the world was hands off of Saudi Arabia. WWE was leaning in at this time. How do you weigh, do you allow personal opinions to interject into whatever you describe as fiduciary duty at this point? I don't know if you're in a role necessarily where the quote unquote right thing is ultimately rewarded or not.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one way to think about it is we're not in a fiduciary duty to do any single transaction, right? Including that one. I mean, really the fiduciary duty is to make the best decisions you can for the company. And that includes, potentially making a decision that has risk to it that could damage the company. So no, it was not an easy decision for all the reasons you said. You asked a really important question. I always say, people tend to do what they're incented to do. And when you said, hey, were you incentivized? There is no doubt that as someone running a business, that you're incentivized to do deals that are accretive to the business. That's true. So is there an incentive to do the deal? Yes. Does that mean you're going to do whatever? And back to the question that you're putting your morals aside? No, it does not. But it goes into the decision making, and part of it also goes in, John. That was a unique moment. And like you said, it was all happening right then and there. My recollection now, I could be wrong, was that there was a lot of speculation about what had happened. People were saying it. Nobody was 100% sure. And I'm not using that as an excuse or to kind of deflect kind of the essence of your question. But what I would tell you is what went into the decision was, yeah, of course the economics went in. Then also went in, is this the right thing? Also went in, are we damaging the reputation of the company by doing this over the long term? Also that went in is, how do we think about generally, not just in this situation, doing business in countries where we may not 100% agree? That was the debate, right? Those were all the things. And it's not an easy one. There's no simple answer. There's nowhere that you can point and say, oh yeah, this is the right answer because look at this. It's judgment. But that was the process. But it's a fair point to say, but hey, George, you were incented to do that. That was one of the incentives. But I'm also incented to make sure the company is around long term. And so you don't want to do something that you think, hey, if I'm going to cut a check, but then I'm going to damage the business, or do something that I say, hey, look, I also, at the end of the day, Vince isn't paying me that much. I also have to look at my family, my wife, my 3 daughters, and do what I think is the right thing for me. So all of it went in, and we made the decision that we made. And in hindsight, I think we went about it the right way, and it ended up being the right decision. But to me, it's always more important to say, did you think about it the right way? Did you talk about everything you should have been talking about? Did you weigh things? Did you talk about it? Like I always say, the world is probabilistic. There's no certainty. So what you really got to think through is, what do I think the probabilities of different things are? Not that you're going to be perfect. That's how you make decisions. I thought we did that. So I was happy with the process we took.
Of course, a lot of the latter part of the book, it focuses on a very public exit you and Michelle Wilson have. You are both named co-presidents in 2018. And then in January of 2020, it's this bombshell announcement that Barrios, Wilson out at WWE. But you add the context that it was the prior summer that you and Michelle were already on the same page of exiting the company. And you state here that if Vince could just pull back a bit more, let us have more autonomy, governance with the board, this could still be a home run for everyone. And you make comparisons to similar roles Bill Gates and Larry Ellison took with their companies. It sounded like both of you had aspirations to become CEOs of publicly traded companies. In that scenario, it seemed to be like Vince McMahon, he was married to this seat. And tell me a bit about that decision and what is the period like after that, what it sounds like a very emotional meeting you're having with Vince McMahon and the lead up to January of 2020. It sounds like you and Michelle were not blindsided by this in January.
No, we weren't. I mean, to your point, and people didn't know the story until it got written. I think it was August, and just, Michelle and I, look, we're still working together. So we've been doing this now co-thing for 18 years. But at that point in time, and you reminded me, the co-president was 2018, but the reality was, if you went back to 2012, 13, we were in essence running the business. Vince had given us that kind of confidence, regardless of titles. And so, but her and I, I remember walking into her office, it was probably June or July, and said, hey, look, I just wanted you to know, I want you to know I'm going to resign, in August. And she's like taking it back, and she's like, oh, and I'm like, look, I want to go find a thing. I want to have my, I want to be the one guy, not the co-guy. And I don't want to do that while I'm still here. The time doesn't make right. Look, I had the flexibility to do that because we had done so well. The stock had done so well. So in any event, and that thing, she tells me, well, I'm doing the same thing. And I was like, oh shit. We talked about, well, how should we talk to Vince about this? And we decide, hey, let's just go and tell him together. That way it's easier. He doesn't have to deal with, us kind of basically, cross jab with him. So we go in, and we end up spending, I thought, we say, hey, look, this is what we think we should do. We'll do a nice transition. There's a great team. You'll have time to bring somebody in either from the outside, because we're willing to stay for however long you need us. So we had what we thought was a great plan. He gets very emotional. His tears, saying you can't do that. I get emotional even retelling it. He said, one of the nicest things anybody's ever said. He said, I built this business for 30 years and I had to pull everybody along. And he goes, for the last 10 years, you guys have been pulling me along. And when I mentioned, well, Vince, we just want our ability to do our own thing. And he looked at me and goes, George, what do you want to do that we're not doing? When have I, Vince, ever said to you that we couldn't do or shouldn't do? And he was right, never. He goes, so what else do you need? I'm like, oh, Vince, look, there's an external element. We all know the thing, but there's something externally. There's ego around having the title, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, we come out of that meeting. Michelle goes, George, I still think we should stick to the original plan. Like, let's go. We'll come back and just say, hey, look, Vince, we thought about it. It doesn't really mean. And I go, Michelle, it is an awesome ride. We're having a lot of fun working together. Let's see if we can figure out a way to do that. So in any event, at that point, we then spent 2 or 3 months trying to come up with a way. You mentioned, there were a couple of recent, actually, Bill Gates stepping down to be the chief technology officer, Ellison doing the same thing, putting different people in the CEO roles, but staying close to the product. We thought that made sense. I think Vince, if he had to redo that decision all over again, I think he would have said, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. That's my guess. I don't know that for a fact, obviously, but that's my guess. But in that moment, everybody started just getting pissed off at each other, and the relationship changed. Everybody got a little shorter with each other. Snippier, a little more edge in the commentary. I can speak for myself. I definitely did that. I remember at one point, it was like November, December. Vince was like, well, what are we going to do? I go, I don't know. And got up and kind of walked out of his office, and it was rude the way I did it. So at that point it was done. In my mind, and I hadn't talked to Michelle about this, in my mind, I was like, all right, we've got the next earnings call posted November 1 was, early February, that usually was the first of the year. We tell people about the year. We were also going to say, because we had now, we were now at a different level. We're like, okay, here was going to be the next 5-year plan, what we had in mind. Now, COVID was going to upend all that anyway, but that was the plan. I said, look, I owe it to the business to stay till that. But it wasn't a good period. Those last couple of months, like I mentioned, it didn't feel good. We had a board meeting January 30th or whatever day it was, and late January before the earnings call, and it was flat. I wasn't myself. I'm usually an energetic guy. I enjoy those things. I was phoning it in because I'm thinking earnings call, I'm out. And then, we come out of that, and, Vince calls me into his office. He's like, yeah, this isn't working. I'm like, I agree. So why don't we just figure out a plan, go back to the original thing, 6 months. He goes, no, we're doing it today. And I go, well, that's not a good idea. And it wasn't for me. In some ways, for me, it was like liberating. It's like, all right, I'm done. But I'm like, that's not going to, it's not good for the people who work here. It's not good for business partners. Investors aren't going to react well to it, all that stuff. But, and look, it's one of the things I admire about him. He's like, George, when you make a decision, you got to pull the Band-Aid. And so he pulled the Band-Aid, but, and the rest is history.
I know I'm covering a lot of stuff here.
Yeah.
But at the end of 2022, of course, we know all of the allegations that have been made against Vince McMahon. He steps down in the summer of 2022, and then he is planning his return to the board of directors. It's been covered very well from this book about this phone call that you receive. What are the assurances he gives you in 2022 that made you comfortable going back into business with Vince McMahon? And of course, this opens up the return of yourself and Michelle Wilson to the board and leading to that transaction. Did he have to give you, because I'm sure you're watching this as a very keen observer about all of the public coverage of Vince McMahon in 2022.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll be honest, I knew about it. I wasn't spending my time poring over things. And because everything that was being alleged either happened long before we got there, and I think there was one that may have happened after, but my recollection is there wasn't anything while we were there that anybody was alleging. So I wasn't paying that much attention. And a lot of the stuff, as you know, John, had already been out there. So it wasn't new. There were some elements about non-disclosure stuff and payments, things like that. But some of the stuff, the fact that he had an affair was not new. So in any event, when he calls me and says, hey, look, I want to do one other big thing. I need the A team. The current folks are great, but they're not up to something that big. would you and Michelle come back? To your point, I know this part I'll keep private. We did have a conversation about it. And look, number one, I was with the guy for 12 years and I saw how, the character he displayed around me for those 12 years. That's what I have to go on. And when he said to me what he said during that call, the combination of my experience with him and what I saw and what I knew, and then what he said on that call, I said, yeah, I'm comfortable. I'm also, for better or worse, I had somebody in a review say sometime, CEOs said, George is an amazing leader. People will follow him into a burning building. The problem he has is that he's always going into burning buildings. Part of that is, for me, the person I am, is I don't walk away when the shit gets tough. I'm a small guy, and I've been in way too many fights because I'm not walking away from one, and I'm not going to walk away from friends who are in a tough situation. Yeah, that's just the way I'm built. I'm wired. I learned that from my father. Vince was in a tough situation, both the business and the issues you mentioned. I got comfortable because of our conversation, and also when things are tough, I just don't walk away. I go into the burning building to help. So that's how I got there.
Did you read the lawsuit filed by Janelle Grant, and did that change anything when you're seeing what was being accused that went, above just affairs?
I read a lot of stuff. I'm not a lawyer. I did talk to one. Part of me said some of this stuff doesn't seem to make sense. Explain it to me, even the chronology and so on. So ultimately, did I read? Yes. Did I get comfortable with it? Yeah. I don't want to comment, on anybody's particular perspective, but I got comfortable. I talked to attorneys, and not attorneys around like cover my ass, not that perspective, but like, am I reading this right? Because some of this stuff doesn't seem to make sense to me anyway. And, and at least their opinion was, yeah, I think you're reading it right. But all of that, John, kind of, went into the decision-making.
It's been described. Would you agree with if someone were to label you a loyalist to Vince McMahon, would that be an accurate label?
No. I'm not a loyalist to anybody. I try to, that, in fact, I'm a somewhat disagreeable person. So I do what I think is right. And if somebody doesn't like it, I'm very comfortable that somebody doesn't like the decisions I make. So for better or worse, that's the way I'm built. It's probably, why Vince, I always say Vince and I had an amazing business relationship. It was like a high performing teammates, right? We weren't buddies. We weren't chit chatting. And part of it is, I think there was a modicum of respect, is that I wasn't in there trying to kiss his ass, and he had been surrounded by that for a long time. That's not me, for better or worse. So yeah, a loyalist? No, I'm not. I'm loyal, right? I am loyal, but I am not a loyalist. I don't do shit because somebody said, hey, I need you to do this. Come in. That's not me. I do it because I think it's the right thing to do.
Just the last few here. I know we've gone above our allotted time here, but just wrapping this up. So as you and Michelle are back in this position, early January 2023, Vince McMahon, he is reelected to the board. Without this scandal, do you feel Vince McMahon would entertain the idea of merging or selling this company? It's something that you had been planting this seed in Vince for a lot of time, and it was resistance. He is quoted as saying years ago that controlling our own destiny is necessary. Like, do you feel like in order for him to return and satisfy Wall Street, like he had to come with this on the table of a strategic alternative?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. But to your point, we had talked about, once we had hit, hit escape velocity, and we were a rocket ship. The thing I had talked to Vince, I'm like, look, the next big stage, we're going to keep growing. We've got an amazing business. There's more to do, but there's the opportunity to either buy someone. And we had talked about UFC, right? Another business about to buy someone, and we run a bigger thing, because I won't bore you with it, but we think that's more valuable. We think, actually, and I rarely say this, but 1 + 1 is more than 2. So we had talked about that. And by the way, in the case of UFC, I'd always said, look, we have a better management team than they do, so we should probably run that. That was back in 18-19. I think, to your question about did he do this because of everything that was going on, I don't think so. I think he came to the conclusion. When he called me, it wasn't I want to sell the company. When he called me, it was like, I want to think about what the best thing to do for the company is. And he said, in his gravelly way, he goes, George, what you always used to say? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, that's what I want to do. And will you come back and do that? Now, do I think there was an element that at that point, he's 77, 78, that he himself is starting to think, how long can I do this? And, is the WWE better off, with a different management team and ownership structure, right? Because I think by that point, it was very different than when he was 65. It's very different, in my opinion. And I don't know, he didn't tell me this, but this is my sense, that he may have been thinking legacy as well. Like, I want to make sure this jewel that I created, keeps shining. And maybe the best way to do that is to let someone else do it, because I'm not going to be able to do it, for a long, long time. So again, we never talked about it that explicitly, but if, based on, my gut and know him, I think it was probably more of that. I don't think it was, what was going on.
Two final questions.
Sure.
Are you happy with the pending conclusion of the shareholder suit? Were you looking for your day to explain your whole role in this process, or are you just happy with the way that we seem to have a settlement that is basically agreed in principle now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I having been in the public markets for a long time, run a public company for 12 years, been in public companies before that. The ease with which people can file shareholder lawsuits, I find somewhat interesting. Maybe on some days find it a little bit disturbing that they are so. To your question, was I looking forward to? I was neither looking forward to it or worried about it. I know we were on the side of angels. We ran a really good process. We got an amazing deal, and in the moment, we got an amazing deal. Value of the company at over $9 billion. When I started, it was less than $1 billion. And then, the stock's almost doubled since then. So not only was it a great deal when we did it, the thesis for the long term has played out. So in any event, I would tell Michelle this, look, we're on the side of angels. So I was neither looking forward to it nor dreading it.
On the book aspect, this will be my final question.
Sure.
Were there any authors or books that you continually went back to when it came to, just your own thesis towards business and sitting down, actually writing your story? Were there any kind of voices that were ones that were of inspiration that you were leaning on, that you wanted to convey in your own words?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say there's kind of foundational texts that have been a part of my business career and also personal, where I would say, hey, Seven Powers is a book that's from a strategy standpoint. That's a book and the thinking in there that I've always taken with. So there was the technical element that was in the back, how the story is going to be told and how those frameworks that I used to transform WWE came into play. Then there was the ones about from a biography. What I didn't want, John, was a 50,000 word press release. These hagiographic biographies where everybody's great. I'm terrific. My wife, some of the stories in there, I know you've read the book, you probably know, were painful. My wife said, are you sure you want to put those out there? And I'm like, look, at this point, I am who I am. I've lived the life that I've lived. I'm not writing something if it's not all of it, not just the good stuff. So there was the element. And so some biographies, I remember somebody told me when I told them what I was looking for, he's like, well, then you don't want to do the Bob Iger biography. And I was like, all right, I haven't read that one. But the one that I had read, which I liked and kind of captured that ethos, was Phil Knight's biography, which I thought was great, because that's one of those where you kind of can feel the honesty. And so that voice was in my head.
The book is Sometimes Wrong, Never in Doubt: How a Cuban Kid from Queens Transformed WWE. It's available now. A lot of interesting insight from a position in WWE that often we don't get books cataloging a very pivotal time in WWE's tenure and also career, both pre-WWE and post-WWE as well. So, George, I want to thank you very much for sitting down, chatting with us. I know there were a lot of topics we wanted to get through, so I do appreciate the time.
Yeah, John, thanks. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate the thoughtful questions.